Good time zone, and welcome to Writer's Conduit. This is the Own Voices Neurodiversity in Fiction panel. Just a couple of things before we get started. First of all, this does tend to be the kind of panel that occasionally attracts jerks. So do you have that at hand there, Sarah? I don't want to switch over to the other screen here because I'll lose your lovely faces. But what Discord room are we in for this panel? Ooh. There we go.
4. Let me double check that. No, we're not 4. I think we're 3. Come on, load up. Load up faster.
Yeah, sorry guys, we were all muted there a minute ago. Hi, welcome to the Neurodiversity in Fiction panel, Own Voices, as part of Writer's Conduit. We're just going to do a couple notes before we get set up. I hope that this is running properly because I am currently not connected to the chat in OBS, so this could be fun, but it looks fine on my manager over there, so I'm going to assume that we are good to go. While we're looking, we're good.
Room number 3 is our default.
Right. So because this is the kind of panel that does occasionally attract trolls, and this is a 2-hour panel, if we have any problems, then in the chat, we will shut down the chat and we will move the conversation to Discord room panel 3 in our Writer's Conduit Discord. But so far we seem to be doing pretty well, so let's cross our fingers and make sure that that's still going on. So, all right. Okay, for some reason I'm connected to the chat on here, but not on my phone or on my OBS. So, woohoo! Oh, hello there, Bigfoot! Thank you guys very much for the raid. I hope you guys enjoyed your panel on screenwriting. It looked like it was a lot of fun. All right, as we get started here, my name is Diane Morrison. I'm also known on Twitch and in the general community as Sable Aradia. I am a science fiction and fantasy and pagan nonfiction writer. I'm the host for this event. I'll also be throwing in my 2 cents worth on the panel because this is an Own Voices panel. I am also neurodiverse. I have a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. I have some general anxiety disorder, depression, and there's something that is still undiagnosed that is either autistic spectrum or central post-traumatic stress disorder. So we're all in the same boat here. And moving on, just because she's directly on my side there, let's go to Gemma.
Yeah, hi Diane, thanks for the intro. My name's Gemma Hooper. I am a trans woman from Adelaide in South Australia. I have various physical disabilities, but for the purposes of this panel, I have been doing a lot of reading about various types of neurodiversity over the last few years because I believe I have ADHD, and I've been digging into the DSM and various other sources to try and find out more about that. So for ADHD fam, good to see you out there. Hope you're well. And yeah, if you've got any questions, Twitter, Blue Jay Gliding, Twitch, Storygirl, find me all the places and ask me all the things.
Awesome. And Sarah.
My name is Sarah. I am author goddess. Okay, neurodiversity. In college, I missed the last appointment to get a diagnosis for bipolar, and I'm probably ASD based on all of the metrics. My son is on the autism spectrum that is diagnosed. I check pretty much all of the boxes for CPTSD and anxiety. And my husband is looking at getting diagnosed for borderline personality disorder, and both he and my daughter are dyslexic.
Right, family. Yeah, my mother is bipolar, and my husband is schizophrenic. So,
my mother is unmedicated, and she should be. I'm not joking. She has a prescription.
Okay, but we're not going to get into that right now. What we are going to get into, though, is, first of all, let's start with what is neurodiversity? Yeah, let's start with Gemma. You seem to, like you said, you've done a lot of reading on this. When we were setting up the panel, I was like, wow, I'm impressed by her information. Let's ask her about that. Let's start there.
Okay. So as far as I can tell, the best definition of what neurodiversity is any form of differentiation in brain function, whether it be because of an acquired situation or a genetic or congenital type thing. Neurodiversity has a lot of different expressions. There's a lot of different types. Probably the best known types of neurodiversity are ADHD and autism spectrum, which have fairly well understood at this point foundations in terms of what the causative factors are. I know in the case of ADHD, it's largely a problem with processing dopamine. So your brain doesn't process dopamine, your reward system's kind of messed up, means there's a lot of stuff that stems from that really important neurotransmitter not being there in the right amounts or not being taken up. So in terms of other stuff, PTSD, one of the things that PTSD does is rewire your amygdala and that sort of lizard brain part of the brain, which triggers your fight or flight reflex, that sort of thing. But it's a permanent change because of the depth of the trauma that the individual's experienced. There's a couple of different types of PTSD, but I'll let those who actually have PTSD talk to those. Traumatic brain injuries are another form of acquired neurodiversity, depending on exactly which part of the brain was injured. The presentation of that will differ. And then there's also stuff like bipolar, which is also kind of technically acquired. They're actually getting to the point where they believe that bipolar is actually, not bipolar, borderline personality disorder, they believe, is an acquired form of neurodiversity. Bipolar is more or less genetic, but it can be triggered by certain drug interactions, that sort of thing. And again, to some degree, it can be a symptom of PTSD, I believe. And the other thing that that's quite common is just anxiety, mood disorders like anxiety and depression. Technically, do kind of come into the neurodiversity side of things, but especially when it is actually because of a difference in brain chemistry, which can be genetic, it can be acquired through other sort of thing, other types of neurodiversity, and it can also be quite interesting from a perspective of sorry, I have ADHD. I forgot where I was going there. Let's move on.
If I can jump in really quick, the interesting thing about depression is it is a standalone disorder, but it is also unique-ish in the sense that it is a very common symptom of about every other disorder that you can have. Yeah. Like it kind of tags along.
Yeah, that's where I was going. So a lot of people with ADHD actually get misdiagnosed as just being anxious and depressed for a lot of years, which is why a lot of adults actually fly under the radar, especially if they're less on the hyperactive and more on the inattentive side of things. Anxiety and depression that can be treated with effectively with cognitive behavioral therapy or similar sorts of things like dialectic behavioral therapy, compassion-focused therapy, those sorts of cognitive modalities of treatment, if they're effective, it's probably less likely to be a neurodiverse form of anxiety or depression, although while you're actually experiencing those symptoms, yes, it is technically a type of neurodiversity. It's just a reversible form.
That's awesome. That is a pretty broad spectrum explanation, and I love it. That's great. So what classifies something as neurodiversity? Right? Like where is the line split between, say, neurodiversity and mental illness? Or, I mean, like some forms of mental illness are also forms of neurodiversity, right?
Yeah. I would say the baseline is neurotypical. So neurodiverse is anything that's not neurotypical.
From a psychological standpoint, because psych minor here,
not a major, perfect.
Minor. Essentially, psychology tends to look at all of the issues that people have and very seldom look at the non-issues. Like you can study psychological disorders, but nobody really has a solid definition for what normal is. So, it's kind of like an ethereal, amorphous kind of idea of what is typical or normal, or all of these other words that don't really mean anything. They don't mean anything. It's weird.
Yeah,
that's fair.
There are norms, however.
Yes.
And basically, from the perspective of even psychologists, when they talk about people who are neurodiverse, they're talking about people whose brain function, from either a neurochemical perspective, a neurophysical perspective, whatever, differs from normative baselines. As far as I know, like that's my understanding of the term. I'm not claiming to be an expert in this, but
none of us
that's
have
pretty much where I come
degrees in
from.
Psychology here, gang. Just so you know, or
minor
neurology either.
Yeah.
That said, just really quickly, the part of my journey to actually acquiring a lot of knowledge about this is actually going through the process of trying to figure out: am I trans? Do I need to transition? What is gender? How do I experience gender? Why is it that I experience it so differently to other people? Could this be something else? So I actually did do a bit of a deep, well, at least a surface dive into the mechanics of most of those other forms of neurodiversity, and actually came to a great deal of self-knowledge about what I don't have, but also understanding what I do have. And that's been really powerful. But that's what informs my knowledge on most of these sorts of things.
Totally fair.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Sarah. There was a thing that was said in the chat that I wanted to address since we were on there, but go ahead because I don't want to interrupt you.
I was just going to throw in that the primary thing that psychologists look at is behavior, and specifically functionality. If you are functional in the current culture, so it is also culturally defined and socially defined, then you fall into more of a neurotypical. If you have functionality issues within the culture and society, then you edge into non-typical or neurodiverse.
Yeah, absolutely. And okay, that's going to lead me on a whole different track, but I'm going to come back to what I was going to say there, right? My friend Siobhan is in the chat. She is also trans. She asked, does dysphoria, in particular gender dysphoria, does that have any bearing? Is that neurodiversity?
Yes. That it actually is in the psychological. I don't know if it's in the oh God, what is the manual?
The DSM.
The DSM. I don't remember if it's in the DSM. I believe it is now, but it is considered a psychological function and is considered neuroatypical.
Do you agree with that there, Gemma?
Look, I know a lot of trans people who are very high functioning, especially once they've finished finished the bulk of the medical transition side of things, and being, accepted in their gender, affirmed in their gender, etc. And it's quite possible to, I believe, in my experience of other people, it's reasonably possible to actually get to a point where where their life becomes less neurodiverse in that context. But at the same time, that could also be, as you say, because they're no longer experiencing dysphoria. And, one of the big points of transition for people with trans identities is to actually alleviate gender dysphoria by getting rid of that cognitive dissonance between brain and body, or brain and self-image.
Yeah, and to be fair, it should be acknowledged that there is a huge difference between a judgment on neurodiversity and neuroatypicality and a scientific determination of classification.
Yeah.
So
very much so. Yeah, I mean, it is very broad set of terminology around neurotypical, neuroatypical, etc.
Yeah.
So, I forgot I muted because the hubby was coughing. Yes, just to clarify, the DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And because we referred to the DSM but didn't explain it. And I'm trying to make sure that this is both a visual and audio experience so that regardless you can follow the conversation, right? So, okay, so that actually leads to a whole, and by the way, also, we have a whole bunch of neurodiverse fam in the chat. Booyah. Welcome, guys. There are ways in which, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself because I might be one of those people who was diagnosed with depression that actually has ADHD. So, moving back to what we were talking about. Yes. So the dysfunction, Sarah was saying, is part of what leads to it being atypical. But what about those who, what do they say? High passing, I guess is the term.
High functioning.
High functioning.
I think is the
high functioning.
The formal term.
Okay. I don't know. Maybe I've been hanging around too many of my friends with gender dysphoria. So, yeah. Okay. So yes, high functioning. What about high functioning people, right? I'm an example of this. It has taken me a very long time to get the medical system to take me seriously, and they still basically don't. They go, oh, okay, you have that diagnosis. Occasionally they give me pills and then they push me off over there. And I'm like, but dude, right? I'm having personal relationship problems. I can't deal with my parents. I'm having trouble going to work and finding out what's going on. Something's wrong here. What about people like us? Like how do we fall in that? And, is there, what are your thoughts on that?
That is totally a problem with the psychological field. And, to an extension, as a U.S. citizen, the medical field and insurance field and other things of that, lots of intersectionality, shall we say. But yeah, because the thing is, primarily, people want to know, are you going to be harmful to other people? Are you going to be harmful to society at large? And then maybe if they get around to it, they'll fix the things that make your life uncomfortable. And the more you can function within society without doing anything that's going to harm other people or society, the less likely you're going to get help, getting out of bed in the morning, because that's your problem. And that is a huge issue with the social and psychological field meshing together and just not taking care of its citizens.
Yeah, I certainly agree with those points. I think that might be a little tangential to Diane's question, though, which was about the high-functioning neurodiverse fam. So people who might be experiencing dysfunction in their relationships, in their work life, that sort of thing, but only at a minor level, at a level which they can deal with. Are they considered neurodiverse? Yes, because they still have problems. They're not functioning in the same way as other people. You can also say that other people also have those issues, and maybe it's because they don't know how to deal with neurodiverse people, for example, because neurotypical people just don't think about what maybe this person's going to react in a bad way to this piece of criticism the way I want to phrase it. Maybe this person's not going to deal with me trying to assign a deadline to them for a big chunk of work, which is a huge problem for ADHD people, for example. Whether those people are neurodiverse, look, the brain is plastic. Psychologists talk about neuroplasticity, right? So is it possible to start building coping strategies that actually start addressing the neurodiversity and start bringing that person back to a more neurotypical state? Possibly.
Or do we even want to, right?
But if that person is taking medication to get there, the fact that they need the medication to get to a high-functioning place means that they're neurodiverse. Totally I don't think, if you still need medication to get you to a point where you are a functional human being, you're neurodiverse.
There's lots of commentary in the chat that I can't disagree with, right? A bunch of people basically saying, actually, the functioning labels are disliked by some people with autism, and it's added, these are just the medical system's way of discriminating. Can't argue at all, and I'm sure that all of us would agree, but that is the formal term that they still use in psychology as far as we are aware, right? So that's why we use the term. We don't agree with it either, at least I don't. I know Author Goddess doesn't. I'm pretty sure Gemma doesn't either. So,
absolutely.
Functionality is literally how society has determined you work within society.
Yes.
And, it's like, okay, sure, whatever, okay.
Yeah. I mean, I would argue as someone who reads up on societies and is a sort of amateur polymath in all sorts of fields, but including psychology, sociology, that sort of anthropology, understanding how societies work and actually understanding that our society itself is deeply dysfunctional.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
And sometimes you have to be neurodiverse to realize how dysfunctional it is. But we'll get into that, our superpowers, right? So
exactly.
That's really cool.
And the other thing is that it is almost universal that people do come up with coping strategies for their neurodiversity, neuroatypicality, in order to be able to move through society and culture. Because let's face it, if you can't move through it, you get punished in very real ways, whether that's financial, socially, emotionally, psychologically, you get punished for that. That is the motivation. I do not agree with that. I personally would destroy that whole system in a heartbeat, but I do not have that particular superpower. So, we're stuck with it. So yes, we all create these coping strategies and these coping mechanisms. And in a lot of ways, the effectiveness of your coping strategies and your coping mechanisms determines the level of functionality you have. And these can come in the form of medication, behaviors. Stimming is a huge one. Stimming is a huge one that is behavioral coping strategy. It's also discriminated against in and of itself, but regardless.
As Sable squeezes the end of her knee here while she's sitting,
right? Whose knee is doing the thing, the bouncy thing.
Yeah.
But also using technological tools. There are apps. There are, like, if you have ADHD or anything that allows you to forget that time is a thing that keeps moving. The phone alarms are a godsend.
Yeah.
Okay, you can remember everything. But yeah, so we do all come up with these coping strategies, and they are the combination of coping strategies, I would say, is as unique as the brain that comes up with them.
Awesome. How do we want to handle questions there, ladies? Do we want to let people ask them as we go, or do we want to save a question period for the end? We don't have an outline that we set up. We all agreed we would handle this in an organic way, so I'm totally open to either way.
Yeah, given that we're here for the audience as much as we are here to make our own points, I'm happy to just go with the flow and address questions as they come up. But also because ADHD fam, I'm almost entirely reactive to my environment. So,
squirrel question.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, well then we'll run with that. So our first question here was from Gideon Navfan, who wants us to kind of get to the point, I guess. We've been talking a lot about neurodiversity as a whole. How do we incorporate it into fiction, into characters, and the way you frame your fiction? That's a big question.
I would say, how I do it is I learn what psychology has to say about that particular neuroatypicality. And then I also find groups in social media where I can just kind of, nose my way into conversations and pay attention to the things that they find complicated, the things that they find hard, the things that they find to be important, really. And then I go, okay, how much of this neuroatypicality do I want this character to have? And what behaviors that are, in this little pool of resources that I have, what behaviors do I want to apply to this character? And I found that a lot of people really like the way I portray the diversity in my characters because of that. It's not just the stereotypes. It's not just the specific psychology analysis of it. It's also real life examples of how things work. And so that's how I do it.
I've got to say that I love Nicola, who is your protagonist in your Rune Spells series. And why I love her is because her PTSD looks like mine. And nobody ever writes about my PTSD. They write about Vietnam veterans having flashbacks and nightmares and sweats and anxiety attacks. What they don't write about is the person who reacts with hostility towards a perceived threat, right? Because that's me, right? And I don't even mean it, right? I'm immediately in an anxious state when the trigger has been made. And it's, for me, again, because it comes from childhood experience, often this is a social trigger rather than a physical trigger. We'll be having, an argument, a heated argument with my spouse, and they'll say something, and the trigger, I'm like, oh, and I'm there, and I'm like a barking dog, and I'm just responding, because I have no flight, right? Just the unique circumstances of my background made flight not an option. I would be followed by the person creating the trauma into wherever I could hide. So I don't have a hide, I have an attack, right? And I feel there's a lot of lack of understanding for that, especially there's understanding for people now, starting to be understanding for people having anxiety attacks, or, I don't have the spoons to deal with this or whatever. But, if you're reacting with hostility, people are immediately angry and defensive, and they take it personally. And I find that so hard. I don't blame them, right? I understand it, but it's really hard. Nicola is like that, right? She responds like that. And I'm like, that's my neurodiversity. That's my PTSD, and I love it, right? So yeah, being aware that there are many different flavors of this ice cream, guys, right? It's not all one thing. Don't go looking up the symptoms on Wikipedia, right? And then use it for the excuse for whatever character struggle or villain issue you want to have, right? Go talk to somebody, go talk to a few somebodies, right? And get their opinion, right? Sensitivity read. And if you are neurodiverse, don't assume your way is the only way this happens. I'm neurodiverse, so I know. Well, my neurodiversity looks very different from Gemma and Sarah's neurodiversities, right? So ask people, right?
Yeah. From my perspective, I would say that one of the most powerful techniques as a writer for understanding neurodiversity is people watching. Less so just random strangers, but understanding how your friends tick, understanding how your family ticks, understanding what drives their behaviors is not only good therapy for you, but it's also a good way to be more inclusive and more sensitive to their needs. But as a writer, understanding that an autistic person is going to be less verbal, they're going to be often responding in shorter sentences, or being more objective and less emotional in how they respond to the world around them, because their emotional frame is so much more internal as a general rule. Because they don't, ASD people learn not to trust neurotypicals with their emotions, because neurotypicals just don't cope with them.
Yeah.
So they get into that habit of pushing them down. People with CTPSD or PTSD in general, I have occupational PTSD as a result of my ADHD coming into conflict with other people's needs around my executive function type issues. So I have a similar rage response, and one of the reasons I have had to leave IT, I was quite a senior IT professional for quite a while, but I've had to leave it because I just couldn't get over the insanity. The insanity is a kind of ableist term, but to a person who is neurodiverse, the fact that neurotypical society has these very, by their standards, reasonable ideas of what to expect of other people, but have absolutely no sensitivity to the possibility that those might actually be unreasonable.
Yes.
Makes me veins pulsing, yelling at people and wanting to say, are you thick? Are you stupid? Do you not get this?
I get you. I totally get you. You bring up a good point. Re-traumatization, right?
Yeah.
Right? Sometimes neurodiverse people are pick up additional things and additional traumas and trauma reactions because of the way in which their neurodiversity is reacted to.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And let's not forget the so fun thing where and I love bringing this into stories when I can, because it completely throws the whole good guy bad guy concept out the window. there are no good guys and there are no bad guys. When you have two people with neurodiversity traumas that are butting heads, they are both triggering each other, and it's like there's no real good way to resolve that, and that happens in real life.
You are describing my relationships. Yes. This happens.
I would like to suggest that we take a moment to define executive function and masking.
Okay, executive function is basically, can I do the things that I need to do in the day? Yes or no?
Yeah.
More often than not. Yeah, organization skills, planning skills, time awareness. You can define it in all sorts of different ways, but basically it comes down to, can you interact with society in a way where you're actually doing the things that are expected of you?
And a big component of that is motivation. Anybody who is laid in bed and sat there and had the argument with themselves that they need to get up now while never moving knows what this means. Your executive function is tanked.
Yeah. And ADHD people have a huge problem with executive function. ASD people, I think, less so, because they can be a bit more internally driven. But that's not to say that doesn't happen. But ADHD people, honestly, because there's no reward for getting up, because we're so dopamine deficient that what we actually need to have high executive function is continuous affirmation and rewards, whether it be one of the things that people talk about when they as a treatment for ADHD is training your brain to understand to give itself dopamine kicks for basic things. So if you actually say, okay, these tasks are things that I'm going to recognize as a win. Getting out of bed, a win. Okay, dopamine hit. Oh, good, I can move on to the next thing.
Yes.
Brushing my teeth, having a shower, getting dressed, getting out the door, catching the bus to work. Right? Those are the sort of things that can be crippling for people with ADHD, and people with ADHD with a dose of PTSD from having failed with the expectations of people so often because they have executive function issues. And this happens for people with depression and anxiety as well, and various other things. But for ADHD people, which is my core neurodiversity, it's brutal. It is considered an executive function disorder.
Yeah, absolutely. Can relate. Yeah, I totally. You're telling. Yeah. Okay. I'm not going to get into it too much. I am going to say something that people talk about when they're talking about, in the neurodiverse community and the disabled community. We talk about having the spoons, right? And it comes from an article. I don't remember the name of the lady who wrote it. I looked it up once, but so the idea is you need spoons to accomplish everything you're going to do in a day. You have X number of spoons, right? Neurodiverse people either have X minus 2 numbers of spoons, right? Or every action that for you takes 1 spoon takes them 3 or 5, right? So you have to marshal the spoons, being aware of, what each thing, how many spoons each of these things is generally going to cost you.
Yeah. Christine Miserandino
That's
the lady who created that term in her 2003 essay, The Spoon Theory. Although she initially wrote it about physiological disabilities,
chronic,
particularly chronic. But I think she was talking about lupus at the time. But if you are disabled and you need to get from your bed to your chair So, like if you're a wheelie, and you want to get from your bed to your chair to get into the shower and then have a shower, that is orders of magnitude more effort and drains orders of magnitude more resources from you than it will from someone else who is just physically healthy and doesn't have any of those challenges. And the same applies to the mental version of mental disabilities. I don't like the term disorders with things like ADHD. I think it's a really pejorative term, and it really shits me. But I will acknowledge the disabilities.
Yeah, I get you. I feel the same way.
Okay, to add on to the spoon theory, I particularly like the extension of that, which is the fork theory. As in stick a fork in it. You can have so many forks stuck in you before you spaz out and can't even. And the idea being that, sometimes doing a thing takes several spoons, and sometimes doing a thing puts a fork in you. And if you have multiple, you can only have so many forks in you at the same time. And for people who are neuroatypical, sometimes things like having to go to the bathroom is a fork. Sometimes things like having to brush your teeth is a fork. It's a thing that is weighing on your mind, and if you have too many things on your mind, you can't even. And the thing that I saw that introduced this to me used the example that there was this guy who he could not deal with the news that somebody in his family was having a problem, like a really big disaster. Like, I don't remember if it was a death or a disease or something. He could not deal with the news until he went to the bathroom, because at that point he had too many forks. And I've had those moments personally where it's just like, I need to get something off of my plate right now in order to deal with this. So yeah, spoons and forks. Yeah, spoons and forks.
I just want to quickly mention ATW Wrights mentioned dyslexia as a form of neurotypicality, and I want to just acknowledge that. And also someone else mentioned dyspraxia, which is another form of neurodiversity, which a lot of people don't really understand even exists. And I just want to acknowledge that both of those are legit members of the neurodiverse fam, and we really owe it to them to understand what those challenges mean. One of the questions ATW writes was, what can we do as writers to address dyslexia, or how can we make life more easy for dyslexic people? And I mentioned using fonts in chat. There's a bunch of dyslexic fonts that are really good and easy for dyslexic people to read, but they're a little harder for neurotypicals to read. So actually doing a cut of your documents, one with a template for using dyslexic friendly fonts and another for using neurotypical friendly fonts, is actually a really legit and simple thing to do. All you need to do is apply a different template to the document, hit print twice.
This is one of those areas where the neurotypical world and the neuroatypical world do not mesh. Comic Sans. Yes. I understand that Comic Sans is an amazingly easy font for people with dyslexia to read. But Comic Sans is, of course, viewed with derision in the publishing world, right? Typical, right? This is a pretty welcome to the world of the neurodiverse person who has to deal with the derision of, the neurotypical.
Why do we have
world.
ramps everywhere? Why do we need to remodel our store to make the doors wider?
Why do you insist on putting closed captioning on the video? Exactly. It's exactly like that. I have dyscalculia, right? And that's also part of that family, right? Like dyslexia, but numbers. I have no sense of time. I can get lost in my own town. I had A's in math right up until they made me do anything that involved a long string of things on a calculator because I kept putting them in the wrong order. So geometry, yes. Algebra, yes. Trigonometry and logarithms, yeah. Right? Yeah. So totally. I'm going to get to some of these questions, guys, now, if that's okay, because I'm like getting ahead of myself here. Right? Happy Book Writer asks, so some neurodiversities don't have a medication option, right? At least I've never been offered any form of medication to curb with my dyspraxia. Yeah, no, some of us just have to figure out ways to cope.
Yeah, dyslexia, dyspraxia, and several others, particularly ones related to brain trauma, that you can't fix it. You gotta find a workaround, and that is unfortunate. It's unfortunate because so many societies do not support those workarounds in any significant way. Like a lot of them do, like you know, they make mouth noises about it, but that's about it.
Anything to add there, Gemma? Or
not really.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm just starting to transcribe the questions
Awesome.
into the panel 3 chat channel.
Perfect.
So that we can actually pick them without having to scan back through chat.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I appreciate that. All right. I will go there actually just to. Okay, panel 3 chat. Perfect. Okay. Yes. So, question. This was from Games GM. Any tools or techniques you recommend to support members with neurodiversity, such as autism and dyslexia, such as overlays for your screen to make it blue, etc.? I can. To me, this sort of comes with the. I don't know what works for everybody else. I know that what works for me is colors, color coding stuff. Right? Okay, so in the setup for this event, we have this sheet that we're calling Panel Tetris, right? Where we're organizing all of the data that we received and trying to keep track of who knows about what. What panels do we have? How do we put it in what order, right? You can imagine how this hurts my poor number dysfunctioning brain, right? This takes a lot of spoons for me. But see, so coffee made it easy for me and for themselves because they colored it with all kinds of bright colors, right? And this is where you run up to people's neurodiversities clashing too, because this made it so that I think neither Shy nor Sarah could function.
Yeah, for me, all of those colors, I can't see the trees then. You know, I'm like, ooh, colors, and there's colors all over, and I can't get my brain to then go in easily to see what those colors even mean. You know, it's just so much input from the colors themselves. So, but this is a really good question, because the thing is, there is no single answer. There are no tools and techniques that are going to work for everyone. What you can do is recommend to people, especially people who are new to Twitch or whatever system you're working on, tell them, hey, great. You know, if they reveal that they are neurodiverse, if you need any help with reading the chat, you can find your settings in the little gearbox and change the size. You can change the font, you can change the colors, et cetera, et cetera. You help people know where they can go to make it work for them. Because as somebody who at least skates the line of several neurodiversities, it's easier for me to figure out what works for me than to try and piggyback off of other things, simply because and this goes into another topic that I do want to touch on eventually, which is the intersectionality of neurodiversity.
Good topic, yeah.
And of course, how to show that in characters.
Yes.
Because, yeah, my ASD is, I'm very mildly ASD. I'm also have the anxiety. I also have the PTSD. All of that feeds into it, changing it into the me ESD. ASD. I have author goddess ASD. I don't have ASD. Period. There's no such thing.
Can I just quickly point out, we've only got about 8 minutes left in the panel. So how about we really quickly
this is a
hammer through
panel,
these questions?
Actually.
2 hours.
This is a 2-hour panel. We're about to reach the halfway point, but
shit, yeah.
Do we need a break, is what I was about to ask, before we get into the second hour.
I'm fine. I bioed before I came on, so.
I still have coffee in my mug, and I have a big bottle of green goodness in my
green goodness
at my desk. So
something like Monster.
Actually, no. It's just cooler lime cordial. But
I have an unhealthy relationship with coffee, but I have lots, so we're good.
Coffee is a nice person. I don't think you can have an unhealthy relationship with them.
That comes to the whole topic of self-medication, but we'll get into that too. All right. So yes, I was also looking at a comment earlier. Melodiman said ADHD meds certainly doesn't make a person neurotypical. I still have loads of challenges, quote unquote normal. So neurotypical people do not have, at least not to this extent. But I have a chance to actually do something instead of faffing around all day, being distracted from my distractions. So there's that. Yeah, they can help you function, but medications don't generally cure the problem, right? And they help you function. They're not the answer, for sure.
It's a tool.
Going back to the questions, and thank you so much for compiling those. That's excellent. Because, yes, the problem is what's going on with my chat at the moment is that it is because I didn't shut down OBS between the two panels because I was, putting all the labels in order and whatnot. It is still showing me the chat that is after the chat that I rated. So that's why I'm not looking at that screen. It's like eavesdropping. So I was relying on my phone, but this is much better. If you have said something important in the chat or you have asked a question and we have missed it, we will give you time to do that at the end of the panel. Let us know. So the next question was, not sure if I'm asking this well, but is the act of labeling the cause/root of the divergence itself perceived as a problem? That is a very good question. Who wants to start with that?
Okay. You've read Too Weird, Sable, so you know this. I have a theory about this. People have always had neurodiversity. Depending on the culture, that neurodiversity has been more or less accepted. One of the most well-known, whether it's completely historically accurate or not, is the concept of two spirits in Native Americans. Neurodiversity is often seen as potentially something that people saw as a gift from the gods or touched by the gods or, something like that. Our current society does not follow that. Our current society actually has extremely rigid ideas as to what is neurotypical and what is allowable. Defining those neurodiversities it would be problematic in a society where neurodiversity was more allowable. In our current society, I think it actually is very similar to LGBTQ labeling. It's not a matter of forcing somebody into a box. It's a matter of allowing people to learn about themselves so they can work on that, whether they need to develop coping strategies or simply understand and forgive themselves for certain things, whatever it is you need out of that, knowing that your ASD is a huge relief. It's not a slap in the face. It's not a label that condemns you. It is a relief. It's like, oh my God, it's not me. Well, it is me, but it's not me. It's
but
not
there's
just
a name
me.
for this, and
Right?
I understand it now, sort of. Yeah.
And more importantly, I'm not alone.
That's a big one. On the other hand, when the medical system puts a label on you, that can be a real problem. Or when your friends put a label on you and then they start using that label as an excuse to dismiss you. That is a problem. And that's why a lot of people don't like labels. And that happens, right? When you get labeled as something, anything, like, the medical system will start looking at you through that lens. So it's a big problem. I have noticed my mother has bipolar disorder. She is also losing mobility and ability to care for herself as she gets older. Her real distress is often dismissed. They figure she is being anxious or paranoid, and they do not pay attention to what she has to say. So I have to advocate for her aggressively when I know there's some real distress going on. That's a problem. So be careful with that. Don't chalk everything up to a person's neurodiversity. Yeah.
One thing that I would say as someone who's got an intersection between the neurodiverse community and with the queer community, in queer theory, labels are opt-in.
Yeah.
We can talk about queerness as even a label that we opt into, even though it's a somewhat reclaimed label. Queer used to be a slur. Queer people are now starting to actually reclaim it and say, well, look, we need a bucket term that isn't 17 letters long. We can allow ourselves to be called queer, and we can use that label amongst our community. I think neurodiverse is starting to get a similar sort of cachet. And I think sometimes it's actually useful to state our labels.
Yes. Because
it can be a way to actually communicate to other people that we do have some potential issues with how we understand and comprehend and interact with the way we interact with the world around us. And that if you can show a little bit of consideration for those differences, we can produce some amazing things. Like ASD and ADHD people in particular have this thing of flow, the ability to just sort of dive into something and just smash through it. With ADHD, it's driven by a phenomenon called that's often described as interest-based nervous system. And I don't think it's quite the same dynamic with ASD people, but our ability to just lock in on something that's engaged our interest, and because it's interesting, it's giving us those dopamine hits every time we keep, the more we keep doing it, the world starts pulsing Matrix style around us, and we're just in there, right?
Which also leads to hyper-focus. You stop noticing the other things around you while you're doing that. I may be guilty of this. Just saying.
Okay.
Yeah.
Reasons we don't sleep, reasons we don't eat, reasons we forget to go to the bathroom until it's almost too late, reasons we need to have the hydrate reminder.
Reasons why I don't own a kettle that I have to put on a stove.
Yep.
If it doesn't time off, then it's probably going to be a hazard.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And, that to me, hyperfocus and flow are pretty interchangeable terms.
Yes.
I don't know about other people, but
totally.
But like, as someone who is a bit introverted, has ADHD, a cube farm is not a suitable environment for me to actually be productive.
No.
Give me an office where I can shut out the rest of the world and go into flow. And I will produce.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's excellent. That is an excellent point. I'm so glad you brought that up. That leads into superpowers. Neurodiverse people often joke that we have superpowers because we've been talking about the struggles, and the struggles are real. But there are also things that we tend to do better or more effectively than neurotypical people because our brains don't work quite the same way. What would you say are some of your personal superpowers, ladies?
I can smell when things are done cooking.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't, like most people, that you get the nose blindness thing, but as soon as it's done cooking, the smell changes just slightly, and I am so attuned to that. I mean, literally, I've come out of my bedroom going, what's cooking, and is it done? Is the bread burning? What are we doing? So it's good.
In the same way that Bruce Willis's indestructible character is the polar opposite of Samuel Jackson's in that movie, I'm the complete opposite. Like I can smell something, and unless it's actually gone acrid black smoke level burnt, it smells good. I'm especially if I'm in hyperfocus and flow.
Yes. I like
but
flow.
To me,
I'm totally going with that term. I like that.
Hyperfocus, flow, whatever you want to call it, is a superpower. I think another superpower that I would say my ADHD kind of locks into is being able to abstract away the rest of the world. Like, this is something that ASD people in particular are really good at.
Totally.
Because they can look at the world very objectively and from very interesting and abstract perspectives that, quite frankly, are just astonishing. Once you start digging deeper into how they describe it all. But it's often very hard for them to communicate how their perspective works, which is kind of half that's the downside. So I think, when you talk about the superpowers, we also have to talk about the downsides as well.
Yes. I like to joke that stubborn is determined that is inconvenient for somebody, right? There's always a flip side. The advantages also have their disadvantage. It really does depend on the situation.
Yeah. I mean, hyperfocus and flow, you get looked at as an antisocial freak by other people because you're just simply not responsive. You're not responding to the social cues that they want you to acknowledge and respond to. So it's like, but I can't do something. I just need to get this done.
Totally.
Go away.
Totally, yes. I guess.
But I want affirmation. I want to talk about my day. I want to talk about my new tiled bathroom. I want to talk about I'm busy.
You're describing most of my arguments, how they start with my spouses in my house. Yes, I'm sorry. I'm busy. I'll talk to you when I'm done. I'm having a personal crisis out here. Okay, I'll get back to you as soon as I've done this chapter.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. You can't do that. You can't do that. But yeah, I totally get it.
But briefly getting back to that point about looking at the world from different perspectives, I think that is kind of one of my superpowers, is that because I am an introvert, because I don't value interpersonal interactions in the same way that many other people do, because I know that half of the times I have a personal interaction with someone, it's going to be negative. I can deconstruct. I don't have skin in the game around what normal is. To me, normal is broken.
Yep.
And that allows me to have insights into
different ways we could be doing
that we
things.
Could improve ourselves as a society. Ways we could. So, and I actually do take a lot of those perspectives into my writing.
Yes. That is a real advantage as a fiction writer. I do have to agree. Yeah, I find it so too.
With my ASD, what I did was part of my coping mechanism was I don't understand why people react and interact the way they do, but in order to function within society, I essentially learned it, and I learned it consciously as opposed to like that. Oh, we're cooking.
Ooh. Oh, that sucks. That was bad timing.
Okay. the fire alarms in this place are
No
insanely
problem.
sensitive. But because of that, people are like, well, I just don't understand why so-and-so did this. And I'm like, okay, so this is, and this, I can literally deconstruct people's motivations with about, I think, hubby says it's 95% accuracy. And I mean, we're talking even people I barely know. So
Aaron, my husband, who is schizophrenic, says exactly the same thing. And he's very good at doing exactly what you're talking about because he had to intellectually teach himself, right? Because the usual unspoken rules that nobody tells you about that I often find very frustrating because I violate them and nobody gave me the memo that was not okay, all right? Just give me the damn memo. Don't expect me to, grok it from like the universe around me, right? But he said he had to teach himself how to do that, right? How to and it makes for great writing, actually, and it makes
it makes for spectacular writing because you have these nuances in motivation, but it makes for really bad watching of political television because you're just sitting there going,
Yes.
I like to tell people I'm Cassandra. Because my brain works very differently, I pick up on intuitive cues that other people miss, and I also have excellent logic over an overall thing. Individual people, I don't understand. Groups, I can usually figure out how they're going to function. And I'll tell you like 5 years ahead of something, oh, this is not going to go well because X, Y, Z, and Q. Right? And everybody will go, you're overthinking it, you're being alarmist, you're doing whatever. And I'll like, yeah, see you in 5 years. And sure as shit, it turned out exactly the way I said it was going to turn out. Right? So, yeah, I get you. But I'm Cassandra. Nobody believes me because it's inconvenient. And they don't want to be told that this isn't going to work. Right? So, it's a bit of a curse that way. Right? Why does it work that way? I don't know. But can I anticipate what you're going to say to me next? Probably not. Can I anticipate whether or not my fidgeting in my chair is bothering you? Nope. Totally unaware.
Yeah. To expand upon that, another thing is with anxiety. Yeah. Sorry, with anxiety, because I hyper focus on so many things. I tend to, not really subconsciously, but almost subconsciously, I track things. If you do not wash your hands, I will be able to tell you every single surface that you've touched afterwards. I don't know why. Well, I do know why. I took microbiology, and that was traumatizing in and of itself. But, my kids will be like, where's my shoes? And I'll be like, last time I saw them, they were in exact specific locations. And they're usually there, unless somebody moved them.
Awesome.
Okay, I'm the Samuel Jackson to that.
Right.
Where did I leave the thing? What was the thing I was looking for?
Yes.
Oh, God. What was I even trying to achieve here? Ah! Anyway.
I've literally found my keys in the refrigerator 2 days later. I'm totally like you. Yes.
Yeah. I do want to touch on something that
please do,
that Diane mentioned briefly, in terms of that ability to, or in fact, both of you kind of discussed this in terms of the ability to kind of predict behavior from other people. One of the characteristics that's really common with ADHD people is we have had so many issues with bad interactions that after a while, once we actually understand that we have ADHD and that is what's causing our bad interactions, we start being able to very quickly start being able to size people up and become people pleasers. That often works to our detriment, because what often works for one person's benefit is often not to our own. Yes. But there's a superpower attached to that, and that is we are incredible mimics. Watch an ADHD person interacting with a neurotypical person, and you will see us mirroring their posture, mirroring their speech patterns. We will even start mirroring their accents.
Mm-hmm. Yes. That is actually fairly well across the board for anybody with psychological or mental neurodiversities, and it is closely associated with masking.
Yes, you brought up and we never got into. Now is a good time. Let's do it.
Because masking is essentially the ability to hide the fact that we're not neurotypical, and it's interesting because there are certain neurodiversities that have more success masking, and there are times when gender or sociological class, et cetera, can contribute to your ability to mask. Women with AD or ASD are actually really commonly known to be excellent at masking, to the point where for the longest time ASD was considered a male disease, a male disorder, whatever, a male thing. It was a guy thing. But the problem is it's simply because of the social pressures and the socialization in primarily Western society that contributed to people who are raised female to learn
or
those
people
masking
who present
techniques.
Female, period. I'd say. Right?
Presentation, that depends on, because from what I've read, it is actually the way female children or female perceived children are pressured and taught and interacted with that contributes to that. So it's not a matter of personal identity, it's a matter of your social perception, or the society's perception of you, rather.
Okay.
So yeah,
Gemma's making mouth expressions over there.
The thing is, now that I've said that, there's like 300 people who could pop up and be the exception to that rule, because of course there's no across the board on this. These are just tendencies, and tendencies should be used very loosely in this, because it is actually more important to look at the individual than it is to look at anything such as sex, gender, or class.
If there's a takeaway from this, let it be that everything is unique. Look at it individually. Mm-hmm. Gemma, I'd love to hear what you have to say about that, actually.
Just on the gendered thing, I can't really speak to ASD, but I can talk to ADHD. A vast majority of women with ADHD go undiagnosed, because, and the fact that they don't get diagnosed is because their primary modality for ADHD is actually the inattentiveness. Mm-hmm. And because patriarchal society has had such freaking lousy expectations on women, and what they can expect of women in terms of their ability to be engaged and attentive and focused and clever, and all of these things that women are, but are not expected to be in the same way that men are expected to be some of these things.
Yes, it is far easier to be a little eccentric if you don't present female. If you are eccentric in your behavior, your social cues, people are all over that. So you learn to mask very quickly because you are punished with ostracism, bullying, aggression, right? And otherwise, socially punished in many ways if you don't actually present socially as expected, right?
Yeah.
This is So yeah.
So a little bit of a stat on ADHD people. Men are a lot more likely. About 75% of men with ADHD present with the hyperactive modality. With women, it's kind of roughly the opposite. So roughly 75% of women have the inattentive side of it. And the inattentive is much harder to spot because we mask, we mirror, we mimic, we don't understand why these behaviors are why they are. We think they're a bit weird and insane, but we do it because it helps us fit in, and that means that we're actually functioning at a level that's higher than, or that presents as being higher than it is.
Yes. But at the spoon cost that you would not believe. Yeah.
Definitely. But the other thing is, as a trans woman,
that's got its own package. Yeah.
I had the inattentive, not the hyperactive growing up. And I have a theory that I don't necessarily think has been borne out, but there are a lot of people who are trans who have ADHD or ASD. And to the extent where for quite a while, having an ADHD diagnosis was actually considered a differential against being trans, against having a trans identity affirmed. That's starting to change now. But my point is that the actual neurological, the physical neurology of trans identities may actually have something to do with the physical neurological differences that cause issues with dopamine dysregulation, that sort of thing as well, and may in fact actually also influence the style of ADHD that people present with. I mean, it used to be that there was ADD and ADHD. They've been merged in the same thing in the DSM-5 because they actually had more in common than they did different. But
makes sense.
But yeah, that modality means that way more women don't actually get diagnosed with ADHD until well into adulthood, and often only after they've been heavily traumatized by their interactions with neurotypical society, which is basically my story.
Totally fair. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to try to focus more on the questions here, right? Because time is starting to get away from us. We still got 40 minutes, so it's not like a panic or anything, but we need to, we need to curb our neurodiversity a little bit. Okay, the next question was, do you feel that having a moment for the neurodiverse character being made aware that how they act is not really, quote, normal, is a good way to make it clear to a neurotypical reader that it is okay for this person to be reacting the way they do in a certain situation? That is a very loaded question, I think. Do I need to read it again so that it, because this is complex?
I think
no, you go, Sarah.
I think it depends on the character. If your character is somebody who is frustrated with the complexities and issues stemming from their ADHD, for example, then yeah, they might have internal dialogue or even external dialogue that indicates that. If they are somebody who is patient, working to be patient with themselves in terms of their neurodiversity, or learning about their neurodiversity, they might have internal dialogue that's like, oh, I remember that this is, related to this. But I mean, the thing is, a lot of the time, you don't think about it. You really don't. Like, you might think about it in more extreme situations, or when you realize your behavior is kind of veering off into the territory of extreme. But for the most part, it's like you just don't think about it like that. You don't. You've at this point in my life, I've been working so long on whatever coping mechanisms I have. It's only the new stuff, the stuff that I've just recently heard about, or the stuff that I'm trying out, or whatever, that I would even think about in a conscious way. So it depends on the character.
For me, I would say that the answer is definitely yes. It can be a very powerful moment for a character to learn that they have a particular disorder. And whether you do that as exposition at the beginning of a story or at the end of a story, I think it can be a powerful moment. What if you are doing that simply to excuse a set of behavior, though?
That's what I was getting at with the
that can
question.
be a little problematic. And if you're simply saying, well, okay, this person's just had their ADHD diagnosis, so they can, so I can write a bunch of scenes where they're gazing out of the window, experiencing something in their internal world, that can be kind of lazy writing. Actually showing them going through that process and letting the audience decide whether they are neurotypical or not, that I think is a more sophisticated approach to it, but I might be just being a little judgmental on that.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, obviously we have a bias, right?
Yeah.
My bias, right, is that okay, I'm not really interested in justifying the behavior of myself or my characters to neurotypical people. I really don't care whether you like it or not, right? I try to do my best to function in society in ways that is not hurtful, right? I have a responsibility regardless of what my issues are. I was saying I tend to snap at things like Author Goddess's protagonist. That's not okay. I can't do that. And if I do, I have to apologize. I'm usually so, it becomes a compounding situation because I react, they react, I react, they react, I react, it just blows up. Might be better to give me some space. It's still not okay that I did that. I have to try to find ways to not bring harm to other people unintentionally, right? So that much I owe the world, right? The rest I don't. So, but I do have a character, right, who I have realized 10 years after I have started writing the novel, right, that they're all about me coping with PTSD, because this was before I had an official diagnosis, right? I was like, oh, this stuff makes sense to me. Because it's the one they write about, this is about having been through a war, right? So, but there are also social aspects to the story that are more like my PTSD, right? And much of what goes on, and much of the conflict that drives the story, is the character figuring out, why do I react like this? How can I mitigate the things that are harmful, right? How can I function after this, right? So if you want to use it as a driving conflict that makes people empathize with your character and care about their fate, obviously I'm 100% behind that, because that's what I'm doing. If you want to use it as an excuse, I'm with Gemma. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Next question. What questions can you safely, this is a good question, what questions can you safely ask someone to more deeply understand their experiences, especially with the goal of faithfully and sensitively writing someone like them, assuming they are neurodiverse in a different way from you?
I'll jump in with this. just say that, look, this is a question in good faith. I'm trying to understand this because I want to be able to provide good representation of a character who's kind of based on some of what you've described with your neurotypicality, or neurodivergence rather. I want to understand what's the internal dialogue happening there. I know it's different from mine. Would you mind explaining it? Just be polite. Don't barge in and say, I demand that you tell me or explain that logic. Like, when you make demands of people, it's a hostile act. But if you say, look, this is a good faith thing, and I really want to do justice to this thing from the perspective of providing representation and inclusion in my writing, people will usually respond pretty well.
Yeah. Sarah, your thoughts?
I would only add that, first of all, if they say no, then they, just respect that. Don't take it personally either. Sometimes you don't have the spoons to explain shit to people.
That's it.
I mean,
That's
seriously.
Yeah.
The other thing is, do not assume that just because somebody is different from you, they are obligated to explain that to you.
Yes.
And I think that is a huge thing with a lot of diversity situations, whether you're talking about neurodiversity, gender diversity, even race diversity, all of these things. People do not owe you anything. And if you behave as though they do, they're going to sense that, and they're going to be less likely to be willing to help you. So, just keep that in mind.
Yep.
Yeah. That's a really good point about entitlement. If you come across as entitled to the information, entitled to their perspectives, that's a very different thing to coming at it respectfully and saying, look, this is a good faith question. You're not obliged to answer, but I would like to understand. It generally will be fairly well received.
Yeah, absolutely. I got nothing to add. They covered everything I would have said.
Next question.
Next question. Okay, that was a repeat question. That's fair enough, because I guess we didn't yet. Okay, not sure if I'm asking this well, but is the act... Oh, no, we did. We did answer the labeling question. People were repeating their questions because they thought we weren't paying attention. I am paying attention, guys. Gemma covered it for me, but I do have mods in the chat, right? And their job is to make sure I get these questions, right? So, or I will. So be patient. I promise you I will get there. Okay. There's one. Is there a way to make a villain neurodiverse with grace? How can I say, hey, there are reasons this person does this without blaming the neurodiversity itself? What a wonderfully sticky question.
Okay. I have a really simple way to respond to this. Neurodiversity in and of itself is never going to be the reason somebody's a villain. Ever. Right. Ever. People with neurodiversity, people with any kind of diversity really, are far more likely to be victimized than to be perpetrators of any kind of abuse and violence. That being said, if you choose to make a villain neurodiverse, it should be a contributing factor only. Something that, okay, so they have PTSD, maybe it led them to seeking a culture that, a group of people that they could feel more comfortable with. So they found the white supremacists, and now they're a vicious Nazi person who needs to be punched in the face. Contributing factor. It is not the sole purpose of them being a villain. It is not even the major reason that they're a villain, because that's just not realistic.
Just to throw in a pop culture reference for that, Thanos, you could argue PTSD from a childhood extinction level event.
Yes. Yes, and so what did he decide to do with it, right? He decided to go destroy literally half the universe, right?
And his logic was incorrect. I'm just saying.
No excuse, right?
Agreed.
Other characters with PTSD included most of the Avengers. What did they choose to do? Save the world, right?
Yeah.
It does not dictate your moral choices.
The PTSD in Iron Man 3 was a beautiful thing.
It was.
Yeah.
They handled that very well, I think.
Yeah.
I'll throw in something else from the from the schizophrenic or sociopathic or borderline personality perspective. Or even, extreme bipolar, things like that, where the emotional response does not function the way it is supposed to because of neurotransmitter issues. Okay? One can choose to be moral intellectually, right? Even if one does not respond to it in the way in which other people would, right? Aaron chooses to behave like an ethical person, right? Even though he does not respond emotionally to things in the same way that you or I do. He, one coping mechanism he had, we met when we were both still pretty younger adults. He decided I was going to be his moral compass. Right? If it was something that I thought was ethically and morally wrong, he would have a checkpoint, right, to refer to. So there are things that can be done. A sympathetic character that still does it horribly, horribly wrong, but the writer really has a good sense of how it works, is Dexter, right? Especially if you read the books, right? That is an amazingly well-written character. Right, for someone with a serial killer's particular set of neurodiverse and backgrounds, right? He's still a murderer, right? But we sympathize with him because he murders the murderers, right? I mean, that's morally gray. That's difficult to write. But if you're looking for a good example of a villain where this is a factor, I recommend those books.
Yeah, and to expand upon that, people like to use words like psychopath and sociopath as an excuse for why people are, criminals or violent. But the thing is, there's a difference between not being overly or at all concerned with somebody else's emotional state and becoming a violent person. Logically, it does not do you any good to go around punching people. It doesn't matter if you, like them or don't care about them or, whatever. Your emotional state in regards to that is, it may be a factor in the way that you behave in a more nuanced fashion. But the truth of it is, you're going to go to jail for assault. Why would you punch somebody just because you don't like them? That is more of a realistic and true to life way that sociopaths and psychopaths function is, you don't go around punching people, not because, you have like some sort of emotional connection to people or you care about what they think or something. You don't go around punching people because then you'd go to jail and that's not fun.
Yeah. The one thing I will just quickly add to that, psychopathy is actually defined as literally having a break from reality.
Yeah.
You are no longer perceiving the world rationally.
Yes, thank you. That's a very, very good point.
So from the perspective of a psychopathic villain, yes, that is a way that you can make that villain villainous in a way that is respectful to the basis of psychopathy, but you have to then paint the what their break with reality is. You have to actually be explicit and clear about what they're not understanding about the world around them that everyone else gets and they don't.
Mm-hmm. And a really good way to do this is that also honors that is to have them have like a paranoid delusion that, you know, people are conspiring in a way that they need to stop.
Yeah, exactly. There's one other just quick thing that I'm going to add to this,
Absolutely.
and that is that nobody believes themselves to be the villain in their own story.
Yes.
Every single person, every one of us, believes ourselves to be the hero in our own story. Now, whether that is rational or valid or realistic, that's a separate question.
Or supported by facts.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that as I have gone through this process of self-love and self-acknowledgement and learning more about myself, I have become a much more generous, compassionate, and empathetic person. Understanding my ADHD, understanding my trans identity, understanding, I've lurched well to the left politically because I am driven much more by compassion and empathy for others than I was when I was more or less high functioning, as people would generally describe high functioning. I don't really like the term high functioning because, as we said, we all wear masks. But so what makes a villain is really the opposition of their agenda to the agenda of the protagonist.
That's why I like the word antagonist to describe it rather than villain per se. I mean, there are villains. I got lots in my story, right? I do.
Yeah.
All of them, I got villains, but not necessarily, right?
Yeah.
Their reality makes sense to them.
Yep, exactly. And the novel I'm currently writing is a queer nanopunk thriller, which actually has a lot of themes about religious brainwashing, that sort of thing. There's a Pentecostal, like really darkly manipulative Pentecostal group. Not that Pentecostalism is bad per se, but
this particular group is toxic. Yeah,
this particular group is toxic, and I know people who've come out of those groups, and this is actually based on some of their testimony to me about what they've experienced. And I've also got an autistic character. I've got a neurodivergent. I've got a character with a traumatic brain injury with severe PTSD as well. I have another character who has significant PTSD because of the way they interacted with the head of that particular church, who was their father, who was very entitled to. Felt very entitled to beat his children and that sort of thing, from the perspective of, I must be their moral compass. I must force them to obey. I must drive them to the glory of God in my particular framework of what that is.
Right.
By anyone else's definition, he's a psychopath. But from his perspective,
he's desperately trying to save his children. Yeah.
Well, save, maybe not, but put them on the right path. Make sure that they are good in God's eyes, as he believes that to be.
Right. Absolutely. So that's a very good question. Thank you for that, by the way. Oh, by the way, I'd like to shout out Moonflower in the panel chat. I see you responding to people with your perspective on it. Since I am aware you were also part of the Neurodiverse Club, I appreciate your responses. I wish we had time to read them all out because they are excellent suggestions. Please go check out panel 3 chat because, yeah, if you want more information, because there's some really good conversation going on in there. People who can speak to things are answering and doing a great job of it. So yes. Okay. So are we ready for the next question, or was there anything you wanted to add there, Gemma?
I was just going to say, we've covered masking, so we're probably up to favorite good representation.
Yes. Yeah. What are your favorite or good representations of neurodiverse characters in media. We started touching on this, but let's continue. Let's start with Author Goddess.
Well, okay, so I absolutely adore how they portrayed Iron Man in Iron Man 3 and even through to Infinity War and Endgame. Honestly, Thor in Endgame, still makes me cry.
Yeah.
The fact, like, one of the lines in Infinity War that he has is, well, then what else do I have to lose? And that carries through to the end of that so hard. It breaks my heart because, people were making fun of the whole fat thing, but anybody who's gone through depression knows that is not an unusual thing that's going to happen.
Motivation to exercise is hard, guys. That takes a lot of spoons.
Yeah, and just like there's a lot of just giving up. And even if you're not completely giving up, there are things that you give up within the larger picture. And so yeah, I mean, honestly, the MCU nailed so many trauma reactions so well, and I thought it was beautiful.
I give them an F for Black Widow, though. Sorry. They did everything else really, really well. They got all the men, right?
Yeah. We can talk about that later.
Okay.
But as for ASD, yes, I know that I don't believe it's ever been officially confirmed, but to me, Newt Scamander will always be ASD, and it is a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful thing. I love the way that is represented. I know there was some, there's been some commentary that was kind of the direction that he was going with that character. So, headcanon, he's ASD, and I love it.
Fair enough. I'm not generally a fan of Rowling these days, but I really do appreciate that, actually. I just wish that, like and we're not going to get into it. I just wish that she'd say it, right? That would be nice. That would be real representation, but anyway, yeah.
I would say Heisenberg is probably coded as ASD to some degree in Breaking Bad.
Right.
The fact that he's got this sort of deep internal world that doesn't mesh with society, and there's almost a psychotic break where he kind of actually says, well, if I don't count to society as I am, then why should I play by society's rules anymore? So there's a point where I think that ASD and that discomfort with dealing with neurotypical behavior and that sort of thing actually snaps into a point of sociopathy, where he actually makes a choice to reject the behavioral boundaries of society as a whole. But I believe that at his heart, he is probably actually coded as ASD to a large degree. In terms of ADHD characters, that's harder. I would say Willow from Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
Oh, yes. She's great. Yes.
Definitely, I would say, is a good example of the sort of dreamy but focused ADHD. Like, she is the sort of person who very easily dives into hyperfocus, but can also does a lot of the mirroring behavior. And I think Alison Hannigan's portrayal of her was actually quite canny in that respect. Whether it was intentional or not, I don't know. But to me, that was always something that seemed coded there. And I think Luna Lovegood from the HP series is your classic dreamy, inattentive ADHD character. Although a little cartoonish in its portrayal, which kid lit, you get it.
I think, okay, so I'm with Sarah. I'm a big fan of the Avengers. I don't think there's a neurotypical one among them, actually. I think that's part of what defines who they are. And I like that because it shows you that, you know, we are our moral choices, right? And that we can make things which make it difficult for us to function within neurotypical society into superpowers, right? So I love that. I think Dexter is an excellent portrayal of the extreme psychopathic kind of mindset, right?
I'd say sociopathic more so with him.
Do you think? It's a hard,
He
hard thing.
understands
Aaron
the
loves
reality.
him for the same reason, right? But
Yeah,
no, but he's got all that thing with his dark stranger. The dark stranger calls to me and tells me to go out and do things, right?
And to be fair, there are psychopaths who are also sociopaths and vice versa. I think the fact that Dexter is aware that what he is doing is illegal and against the law, and
probably wrong morally,
and probably wrong, puts him in that, like, from an intellectual perspective, he totally gets that, which puts him in this sociopath camp. But as you say, the dark stranger, very much the psychopathy camp, or possibly even, rather than psychopathic, possibly even schizoid.
Right.
Well, and that kind of plays into the excuse me. There's kind of an idea that just because you have a break from reality doesn't mean that break is constant or permanent.
Correct.
Like,
yes,
you can have a break from reality with moments of lucidity. You can have a break from reality that is, you know, sporadic. You can have, so it could be possible that the break from reality is something that happens in particular situations as opposed to constantly.
And later in the series, Dexter actually gets more and more conflicted as he starts to confront the reasons for his PTSD as a child, which informs so much of that psychopathy. He starts to understand just exactly who that dark passenger is.
Yeah. Yep, that's it's a good series. I really enjoy it. The books are amazing.
And that actually changes his perspective. He actually gets disarrayed to some degree by that, discombobulated.
Yes.
By that whole
spoilers
realization.
all over the place here, but yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah. One last question we have holding as far as I can tell, and this is a very good question. It probably will take us the rest of the time to answer it. Do you find that you accidentally give your characters that are meant to be neurotypical atypical traits? Because I have that problem, especially concerning my own sensory issues because of my ASD. I just don't know how much noise is too much for neurotypicals. That is a marvelous question. Who wants to take that first?
Well, I don't think I've ever written anybody specifically to be neurotypical. I know I've intentionally written neurodiverse characters, but I don't believe I've ever written anybody neurotypical. And I will support that choice by saying, if you can find me an actual neurotypical person that has no behavior or symptomatic indications of any neurodiversity whatsoever, then I will do my very best to write one of those characters.
Yeah. My response is very simple. Most neurodiversity sits on a spectrum. Or, you know, for each type of neurodiversity, there is at least one spectrum on which they're defined. And like in the case of ADHD, there's two. There's the inattentive to hyperactive, which are kind of two orthogonal dimensions. But on top of that, you've got the degree of dopamine dysregulation as well, which means you could either be very high functioning or very low functioning, depending on how things are playing out in your life. So yeah, I think I don't think there is such a thing as a neurotypical character with neurodivergent traits. I think all people have some sort of intersection with some degree of neurodivergence. The question is how much. And if it starts to affect your life, then you start getting more to the point where in the psychological realm they will define you as being neurodivergent. If you're making do and you're getting by without the need to seek out support or therapy, or that you're not struggling because of that trait, at that point you're not broadly going to be defined as neurodivergent, even if you might have hints and smatterings of different types of neurodiversity in how you portray that character. And I think that's a completely cool thing to actually show that, you know, people, these things are spectrums, and it's okay for people to be closer to the more typical end of those spectrums without actually necessarily calling them out as clinically ADHD or clinically ASD or clinically, you know, the clinical definitions are very different from you know, just who people are, because people aren't ones and zeros.
I've seen where this question comes from, because this discussion has happened on Writer Twitter a couple of times, right? And it's a very good discussion. Often, neurodiverse people will write their characters with no specific intentions as to their typicality in mind, and turn in a manuscript to an editor or an agent. And the editor or agent will say, people don't act like that, right? So then, okay, so how do you approach that? Do you actually take that to heart and go, people don't act like that? Because clearly people do act like that. You might act like that. Other people you know act like that, right? So what do you intend to do with that information? You could say, okay, so I'm neurodiverse. Here's my deal. And I'm not consciously writing this character as neurotypical or not neurotypical. So this is just something the character is doing. If after that, the editor doesn't like it, you could go find another editor, right? If you want, right? Or if you do want to work with this editor, sensitivity readers work the other way too. Take it to a neurotypical person and say, why doesn't this make sense? What is wrong with the way I'm having this character react? Can you tell me what would be a more typical reaction, right? And then write that in there. I've never physiologically been in a male body. I ask questions of people who are in masculine bodies, how they function, right? Because I don't know. You can do that with neurotypical people. You know, I'm sure there are lots of neurotypical writers out there who would be happy to help you in return for your sensitivity reading, right? So there's an option, right? Or, you know, tell people to blow it out their ass and write it anyway, because that's okay, right? For example, I'm never again going to put up with any criticism where somebody tells me there is no way that villain is realistic because people are not that evil. Over the past several years, I have seen many examples that have proven that wrong, right? So I'm not interested in that criticism. You decide what you're going to take out of it, is basically the TLDR out of that.
Yep. And just as a quick point, that ties back to the other question that was asked earlier about how to ask people about neurodiversity. The same rules apply to how to ask about neurotypicality.
Yes, that's a very good point. Yeah. All right. We appear to be like, whoop, I'm on the wrong screen here. Okay, there we go. We're near the end of the stream now. That time just flew by for me. So thank you both so much for such a wonderful discussion. And thank you to everyone in the chat for your amazing questions. You know, this was great.
I'm just saying we could do this for another 2 hours.
We could. I could easily do this for another 2 hours. Wouldn't be any struggle for me at all. I'm having so much fun. This is great. You know, response-based, what is it? Dopamine-based neurosystem? Or
we're rewarding ourselves.
Yeah, there's a thing called the stream overlays. Anyway, squirrel. They say there's 3 types of neurodiversity. 3 pillars of ADHD brain.
No problem.
Really good website called the ADHDmanual.com, by the way, that talks a lot about this. Interest-based nervous system, which addresses the dopamine stuff. Exaggerated emotional responses, which is actually something that's driven by the lack of dopamine regulation. Again, and the other thing is rejection-sensitive dysphoria. ADHD people do not deal with criticism well. They do not like. They don't respond happily when they muster up the courage to ask someone out and they get knocked back straight away. It's, you know, our executive function is such that we have to go to such extreme efforts to get shit done, that when we get shit done and it's not there, we don't get the dopamine hit at the end, it's crushing for us.
Yep.
I don't know really what that was about, other than responding to the point about the interest-based nervous system. But anyway, random facts about ADHD, and we've chewed up another minute.
No, that's totally fine. This is we're getting all kinds of thank yous in the chat. People say we've been very helpful and very informative. Where can people find you online? Because obviously, I'm sure we're all available if people have more questions or want to connect. Where do we find you? Sarah, let's start with you.
authorgoddess.com, authorgoddess Twitter, authorgoddess Twitch, pretty much, yeah, that's where I am. Authorgoddess Discord, you can hit me up in the CONduit Discord and find all the other stuff there.
For me, Twitch TV/Storygirl, Twitter.com/Blue Jay Gliding, typing it out as I say this, and I'm also on Patreon at patreon.com Gemma Hooper author, and it's Gemma with a J.
Brilliant. And I'm Diane Morrison, aka Sable Erodia. You can find me just about anywhere on the internet except for Facebook and Instagram, and that does include Patreon and World Anvil as Sable Erodia, as we get distracted. And I am also at DianeMorrisonFiction.com, and you can find my books on all the major retailers. So. And thank you very much. We are now going to raid Laura VAB for, I had it just a second ago, it looked like a great, yes, Surviving the Process and Hard Times is the next panel. But of course, if you want to check out other panels, you can find them all at the redirect links. All events now, right there, or at the website. Yes, don't forget that the raid show is continuing CONduit. And I've had a great time, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Diane and Sarah, for your insights. It's been really cool.
It has been great. Thank you all.